Hoosac Tunnel, an active rail line which connects the Massachusetts cities of Florida and North Adams, as well as being North America's 6th longest active rail tunnel and 4¾ of a mile long. Its history has created a tale of progress, triumph, and legend, but one sharing tears, bloodshed, and tragedy. Some say it's cursed, others say it's haunted by the spirits of the restless. But one specific part of the story is true. It's the mass grave of over 200 lives lost since its construction.
The tunnel project was originally proposed in 1819, before railroads even existed, instead being a canal to connect Boston to upstate New York via the Deerfield River on the east of the Hoosac Range and the Hoosac River on the west. This project was shelved and later reborn as part of the new Troy and Greenfield Railroad. The project was nicknamed the Great Bore by its critics, including future Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who said that he would like to wall up a dozen lawyers at one end of the tunnel and put a good fee at the other end of the tunnel.
The most important proponent of the northern route and the Hoosac Tunnel was Alva Crocker, a self-made paper mill owner from Fitchburg, Massachusetts. The project, which was promoted by Crocker, but mostly organized and engineered by others, notably Herman Hopp in the early ages, and several other firms under contract, under the direction of several head engineers assigned by the state of Massachusetts, which took over the project after it initially failed and went bankrupt. In 1841, Crocker formed the Fitchburg Railroad between Boston and Fitchburg.
In 1844, Crocker incorporated the existing Vermont and Massachusetts Railroad, which ran from Fitchburg west to Greenfield, as well as northward to Brattleboro, Vermont. In 1848, Crocker secured from the legislature a charter for the Troy and Greenfield Railroad, with provisions for a tunnel through Hoosac Mountain. Work on the tunnel began in 1851 and continued until 1861, upon the breakout of the American Civil War. After the war had ended, work quickly resumed and the final rocks were cleared in 1874, with the end in North Adams being built with wooden storm doors to protect the tunnel from drafts. The first train passed through the two-tracked tunnel on February 9, 1875, and in 1910, the line was electrified. In 1954, the wooden storm doors on the North Adams end were replaced with a large metal garage door, followed 4 years later with the shutting down of the electric lines in 1958. Much of the overhead lines and support beams remained in their places until 1973. When the tunnel was made a single-track passage. This is the state of the tunnel today.
Throughout construction of the tunnel, a dark history emerged, starting with a useful but deadly chemical compound, nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin was a highly explosive mineral being tested for blasting through mountains in 1865. In March of that year, 3 explosive experts decided to use the explosive in the tunnel. Ned Brinkman, Billy Nash, and the lead expert, Ringo Kelly, primed a charge, then ran to a safety bunker for the detonation. Except, Kelly set off the nitro before his partners got to safety. Ned Brinkman and Billy Nash are buried alive under tons of rocks in the explosion, and Kelly disappeared soon after. Kelly's actions that day roused suspicion. Was this simply an accident, or was this murder?
Workers found Ringo 10 days after the incident, 2 miles deep into the tunnel, dead, very near to where his partners had died. Markings on his body suggested that he had been strangled to death. Without any suspects, however, the case went unsolved, but the tunnel workers were convinced that Ringo had been killed by the vengeful ghosts of his dead partners, Nash and Brinkman.
A high mortality rate was one thing, but ghosts were another. A few of the workmen reported hearing a man crying in agony coming from inside the tunnel and refused to enter after dark. This was a problem. In September of 1867, a former cavalry officer and mechanical engineer named Paul Travers was asked by authorities to investigate. They entered, expecting to find nothing but the sounds of wind howling through the rock. Instead, the two of them heard the voice of a groaning man, just as reported by the more superstitious workers. Travers wrote of the experience, "I'll admit, I haven't been this frightened since Shiloh."
1 month later, on October 17th, workers were digging the tunnel's 1,028-foot vertical exhaust shaft when a candle in the hoist building ignited naphtha fumes from a leaking gas lamp. The resulting explosion set the hoist on fire, sending it falling into the shaft. 4 men near the top of the shaft escaped, but 13 men working 538 feet below were trapped by falling naphtha and pieces of iron. The water pumps inside the tunnel were also destroyed, flooding the shaft. A worker named Mallory was lowered into the shaft by rope the next day. He was overcome by fumes and reported no survivors. No further rescue attempts were made.
Workmen began to tell stories about seeing the dead men's ghosts on the mountaintop, in the tunnel, or nearby, carrying their tools. They claimed hearing muffled wails near the flooded shaft, what seemed to be cries for help from the entombed victims, the voices of ghosts who had not yet died.
A year later, workers reached the shaft's bottom and found that several of the victims had survived long enough to construct a raft before suffocating. After the bodies had been recovered and been given a proper burial, the sighting stopped, but the moans and the groaning of the dark tunnel kept up, and workers remained fearful.
4 years after the explosion, 2 men named Dr. Clifford Owens and James McKinstry entered the tunnel at 11:30 p.m. to investigate. Here are his findings.
We had traveled about 2 full miles into the shaft when we finally halted to rest. Except for the dim smoky light cast by our lamps, the place was as cold and dark as a tomb. James and I stood there talking for a minute or two, and were just about to turn back, when suddenly I heard a strange, mournful sound. It was just as if someone or something was suffering great pain. The next thing I saw was a dim light coming along the tunnel from a westerly direction. At first I believed it was probably a workman with a lantern. Yet, as the light grew closer, it took on a strange blue color and appeared to change shape almost into the form of a human being without a head. The light seemed to be floating along about a foot or two above the tunnel floor. In the next instant, it felt as if the temperature had suddenly dropped and a cold, icy chill ran up and down my spine. The headless form came so close that I could have reached out and touched it, but I was too terrified to move. For what seemed like an eternity, McKinstry and I just stood there, gaping at the headless thing like 2 wooden Indians. The blue light remained motionless for a few seconds, as if it were actually looking us over. Then it floated off towards the east end of the shaft and vanished into thin air. I'm above all realist, nor am I prone to repeating gossip and wild tales that defy a reasonable explanation. However, in all truth, I cannot deny what James McKinstry and I witnessed with our own eyes.
In total, 196 workers were killed by multiple accidents since 1865, either by explosions, falling rocks, suffocation, drowning, falling, or other causes. Survivors began to infamously call the tunnel the Bloody Pit because of just how many had died there.
Then, of course, the tall tales and rumors stopped when the tunnels was completed, and trains began to use the route regularly. However, not many know today that these first accidents were just getting started. Perhaps those 196 men who had died had not found peace by a long shot.
In 1874, 3 months before the first train passed through, A local hunter named Frank Webster went missing in the vicinity of the dark chamber. When searchers found him 3 days later, he was in a traumatized condition and said that voices had ordered him into the tunnel. While wandering inside, he was confronted and then attacked by horrible apparitions who ripped his rifle from his hands and beat him over the head with it, after which he could remember nothing more. The following autumn, a fire tender named Harlan Mulvaney was delivering a wagon load of firewood into the tunnel when he went missing. The horses and wagon were found in the woods soon after, but Mulvaney was never found.
This was only a telltale sign of what was to come. In 1876, a year after the tunnel's completion, a worker named William Richards fell while working at the infamous central shaft. A few years later, a circus tent man named Sam Caesar was killed when he fell from the top of a train and slipped between the cars, where he was crushed instantly.
Many of the accidents were caused by low visibility in the tunnel. Prior to the tunnel being electrified, poor ventilation caused the tunnel to be engulfed in smoke, which made it next to impossible to see clearly, leading to at least 36 train versus train accidents and train versus human accidents involving railroad workers, all of which claimed many lives in the decades following 1875. One such accident occurred in 1894, when one train rear-ended another inside the tunnel. 2 men were killed.
One particularly unlucky weekend for Hoosac occurred on November 23, 1901, which saw 3 incidents in rapid succession. During that afternoon, an eastbound passenger train collided with a freight train that had been halted in the tunnel. Several cars were destroyed, but no one was seriously injured. 4 hours later, workers were cleaning up the mess when one worker heading back from the wreck was struck and killed by a third train which was heading westbound. The workmen hadn't heard the train coming due to the noise from the cleanup. The following day, another worker by the name of Michael Powers suffocated from the coal gas, which, while a constant problem, had been worse that day because of the central shaft's malfunctioning ventilation system.
Perhaps the worst of these accidents occurred on February 20th, 1912, after electrification. A Boston, Maine electric locomotive was helping an eastbound passenger train through the tunnel. The 6 box cabs were built specifically to pull steam-powered trains through without engulfing the tunnel in smoke. For this run, number 5004 was pulling the train.
At first, all goes smoothly as the train slowly rumbles into the tunnel. Suddenly, the main engineer saw a danger signal ahead and jumped off number 5004 to let the brakemen get on and halt the train. But instead, the train sped up. Seconds later, 5004 plowed into the end of a 32-car freight train pulled by sister box cab 5001, which was stopped in the tunnel. A shower of sparks erupted from the electrical lines overhead, and a raging fire started, killing the 4 men aboard 5004, injuring 2 passengers, and crushing the box cab. The wreckage burned unchecked for several hours, and the tunnel remained blocked for several days, with the intense heat from the fire causing the tunnel wall to collapse. Remarkably, 5004 was rebuilt following the accident, and 34 years later, it hauled the last electric train through the tunnel before dieselization. The cause of the accident was later determined to be a malfunctioning signal. 5004 had passed a green signal just ahead of the tunnel, but it should have been red because of the halted 5001 inside.
Not all of the causes of death in the tunnel were as cut and dry, however. Sometime in 1912, a section foreman named Andrew Cullen killed 2 of his crew, then committed suicide after suddenly becoming insane. There had been no quarrel between the men, and the motive for his rampage was never discovered. Another suicide had been attempted there by a woman 17 years earlier. The attempt failed, but no reason was identified for that act either. Another death shrouded in mystery occurred in 1935 when a young man believed to be named Albert de Bruckner was electrocuted while riding a freight train through the dark passage. The body was identified by his mother and was buried in North Adams. Matters were complicated 12 years later, however, when de Bruckner turned out to be alive and well living in California. To this day, the identity of the body buried under this name in Southview Cemetery remains unknown.
One of the few post-1875 accounts was that from Joseph Empacco, who worked in the tunnel in the 1920s. Empacco claimed that ghosts had saved his life on 2 occasions by shouting warnings to him. Once, when a train was about to mow him down, and again when he was nearly electrocuted. In 1984, Ali Allmaker wrote an account of the tunnel's eerie atmosphere. Mistakenly referred to as female in all recent accounts, Mr. Allmaker was a philosophy professor at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts with a part-time interest in ghost hunting. He described how he accompanied a railroad employee on a tour of Hoosac Tunnel, and throughout felt the sensation that someone was following close behind him. He also mentioned that some students from North Adams had left a tape recorder in the tunnel overnight, and when they retrieved it, strange, muffled voices could be heard. Some sources also cite the 1976 report from an Agawam parapsychologist of seeing the clear form of a ghost in an old-fashioned clothing eating his lunch in front of her. But this account originated with a tabloid story by The Star and appears to have been made up as a publicity stunt.
Given the legacy of tragedy and mystery surrounding the tunnel, its reputation as one of the most haunted places in New England should come as no surprise. There are numerous first-hand accounts of inexplicable occurrences witnessed there, stretching back for well over a century. Stories of phantom workers, floating blue lights, and strange voices in the long, dark abyss of the tunnel continue to this day. There are even wild accounts of a bricked-up room where unspeakable horrors are hidden. Though it is still actively used by freight trains, a handful of people every year brave the dark, unpleasant, and potentially dangerous 5-mile hike. Anyone endeavoring to attempt this trip, though, should first have a good long think on the fate that has befallen many others while passing through Berkshire County's Hoosac Tunnel, the Forbidden Mountains' mouth to hell. Many people out there are not the only one who have witnessed a paranormal entity. I have myself, the very first day I went to Hoosac Tunnel. Some of you may not believe me. Some of you may think I'm crazy. That's fine. Not a lot of people believe in ghosts. But I'm a firm believer. The very first day we went to Hoosac Tunnel, there were a few teenagers that were there before me and my mother. And they claimed that no train has come by. And they were being honest too, because they were there an hour before us. Then, when Mom started mentioning about the ghosts in the tunnel and the phantom trains that were there, even though I don't believe there are any, a train horn sounded out of nowhere. We thought a train was about to come across the river that was going across the bridge leading into the tunnel. But they went down the tracks, and there was no train. We never heard a prime mover. We never heard rumbling. And it was only half of a horn. The other half sounded like it was cut off. I can't explain what the horn sounded like. All I know is that it was a diesel horn of some sort. Could it have been one of the electric locomotives returning to work? I don't know. But this was my first paranormal experience in that tunnel.
Well, there you have it, folks. Even my best friend has witnessed at least one of the horrors of this phantom chasm. Could there have possibly been a ghost engine that we have not known about that went down in this area? Could it have been a normal train? Could it have been one of the workers calling out for her or telling them to go away? Or could it have been something else
one of the ghosts imitating a locomotive. We may never know. But remember, if you ever go to Hoosac Tunnel, think about those who died. And think about what may happen to you if you dare to enter the bloody pits. Happy Halloween. From me and Autumn.